A Taliban attack in Afghanistan killed dozens of security personnel on Monday. At the same time, members of the armed group are holding talks with U.S. diplomats in Qatar. So, is the Taliban using a strategy of attacks and talks? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. Afghanistan has been at war for much of the past 40 years. In late 2001, the United States sent troops in response to the 9/11 attacks, and the withdrawal of those troops has been one of the sticking points as talks get underway in Qatar between U.S. and Taliban representatives. But hours before those talks began in Doha, Taliban fighters launched one of their most daring attacks in recent months. A gun and bomb raid on an Afghan intelligence and military base southwest of Kabul. It killed dozens of security personnel. Many are now looking to see if the timing of the attack, coming on the eve of those talks, could have an impact on negotiations. There have been several efforts to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table, but the armed group has repeatedly refused to hold direct talks with the Afghan government. Instead, it's insisted on negotiating with the U.S. with the primary goal of forcing foreign troops out of the country. At the request of the U.S., the Taliban opened an office in Doha in 2013 to facilitate talks. The U.S. shifted its policy last year and said it was ready to hold direct talks with the Taliban and discuss the role of international forces. A round of talks took place in the UAE last month before officially resuming in Qatar this week. Let's bring in our guests now in Kabul. Omar Zakhilwal, he is a former president's special representative to Ashraf Ghani and Afghan ambassador to Pakistan in Islamabad. Imtiaz Gul headed the Center for Research and Security Studies. And in Washington, David Sedney, former Deputy U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Thank you all for joining us. I appreciate it very much. Omar, I'm going to start with you. The timing of this attack, what message do you think the Taliban is trying to send?
It's not a very good message because talks need an environment that is more conducive, and violence reduction would be the right response. But unfortunately, the attack yesterday was to the contrary. But at the same time, it's important that this does not derail the ongoing talks and that we focus moving forward with this.
Okay, same question to you, Imtiaz. What message do you think the Taliban was trying to send doing this and at the time that they did it?
I think being a party to the conflict, being one of the stakeholders, they just wanted to underline their own strength on ground. They just sent a message to all and sundry that whatever the Kabul government may think of them, they can still penetrate as far as even the intelligence and security facilities of the government. And this is basically to underscore their strength on ground right now.
And David, Imtiaz brings up a good point, not just this attack, but specifically the target, just all of that together. What type of message do you think they're trying to send?
Well, I think it is actually quite common when talks are underway for those involved in a conflict to try to gain advantage. In particular, the weaker side tries to mount attacks in order to maximize its strength. And in this case, the Taliban are clearly the weaker side, and this attack is part of their effort to strengthen their position as they go into talks. The other message this attack sends is that the real target of the Taliban is the Afghan government and Afghan security forces. While the Taliban rhetoric has been that this is about foreign troops and U.S. presence, in fact, those who have been killed by the Taliban are overwhelmingly Afghan. And over the last 4 years, since the U.S. Basically drew down most of its troops in Afghanistan, the Taliban have increasingly been targeting Afghan security forces. So this is actually a two-pronged message by the Taliban. First, they want to get stronger in case talks go forward. But second, they're sending a message to Afghans that you are the target and we're going after Afghans.
So what has been seen as one of the sticking points, one of two major sticking points, is which would be the release of Taliban prisoners and their insistence that U.S. troops leave. You're saying you think that's a bit of a pretense for what they're really after?
Yes, clearly the Taliban have not yet made a decision over whether they want victory or whether they want peace through negotiations. So far, their stance in the negotiations has been that they want victory in the negotiations by marginalizing, eradicating the existing Afghan government and power structure. They would be happy to do that by violence, which is what their primary tactic is. If they can achieve the same result through negotiations, they're happy to do that. Once the Taliban decide that their goals are better served by peace talks, they will sit down and talk to the other Afghans. But right now, I would say they're basically afraid to do that because they know if they sit down with other Afghans, they would have to have real discussions about the real future of their country, which I don't think the Taliban is prepared to do yet.
Okay. Imtiaz, do you agree with that, that this is what the Taliban is after is really much more targeted towards Afghans and Afghan government and much less about a U.S. presence there?
Well, I think it's a political struggle or political fight that the Taliban have launched, and for them, their primary interlocutor is the United States, which is footing the bill of the entire government and the security forces. And I think just because the American troops are so insulated through the security cover that the Afghans provide, so very logically, the first victim the first victim basically are the Afghan security forces. That's why increasingly we have seen much bigger casualties among the Afghan forces rather than those of the United States, the US Marines. So primarily, I think they are going about their mission, and the mission is to force the American troops out of Afghanistan. And this has been their stated demand as well. And in fact, yesterday, the message from the Taliban spokesperson was also that the talks are specifically aimed at extracting a deadline for the American pullout from Afghanistan.
Omar, I'm going to get to you in a minute, but I want to circle back to David, if you'll just bear with me for a moment, because David, I could see that I think you took a little bit of exception to some of what Imtiaz said.
Yes, I always appreciate being on a panel with Mr. Imtiaz Gul. He and I have spoken on panels before. I respect his views, but I think in this case, the statement that the primary target are security forces is not borne out by the facts. The primary target of the Taliban over the last 4 years has been Afghan civilians. The people that the Afghan Taliban have killed the most are Afghan civilians by far. Afghan security forces are sometimes the target, and this attack yesterday was clearly an attack on Afghan security forces. But the people who have borne the brunt of this are the Afghan civilians. Many more of them have been killed and wounded. And the fact the Taliban are killing so many Afghan civilians has led most of the Afghan people to reject the Taliban, which puts the Taliban in a difficult position when they want to seize power over a nation where over 80% of the people oppose them.
Omar, would you like to weigh in on this?
Well, this attack may not have the full approval of the entire leadership or the entire relevant cadre of the Taliban. Whenever there are peace talks, there will be groups within the Taliban who oppose such talks, and they believe in their military victory. And it's not the first time that when there are hopes for talks and then there are some initial steps, violence has mounted. And therefore, yesterday's attack goes in similar lines and therefore is not an exception. That's one. Second, targets of opportunities and targets, soft targets and all that, if they come their way, they have taken advantage of those before, and certainly yesterday was again not an exception. This was to them an opportunistic move. Maybe timed with peace talks, maybe it wasn't. We don't really know. But they did take advantage of the opportunity, and they did inflict their deadly attack and all that. And I do agree with David that over the past many years, because the U.S. forces, the number has significantly reduced, and therefore the casualties. But no doubt, this also at the end is a pressure on the U.S. forces and the U.S. government as well. But for them to prove that their military strength and all that, that's already been recognized. We are talking peace with the Taliban not because they're the most loved groups, but because they are a fighting force. And that force has been recognized, and that's precisely we are negotiating with them peace.
David, what motivation does the Taliban have to actually negotiate? I mean, so far they control roughly about half of the country. What reason do they have to negotiate it and compromise?
Well, first of all, let me clarify that. You say they control almost half the country. The Taliban control a lot of the rural areas. They control a certain amount of land. But while the Taliban have maybe increased the amount of land they control, they actually control less people. Whenever the Taliban move in, people leave. And at the same time, Afghanistan is becoming a more urbanized society. So the Taliban control less of the people. And in the end, a war is about people. So the Taliban control less people now than they did 4 years ago. You asked what had changed. What's changed, apparently, is the role of Pakistan. The talks that are going on in Doha right now are accompanied by a visit by Pakistani Premier Imran Khan to Doha at the same time. The U.S. special negotiator left Pakistan the other day saying he expected more steps from Pakistan.
David, actually,
the U.S. Central Command is meeting with General Bajwa today.
I actually
so
do have
a lot depends on Pakistan.
I actually have a quote. I was going to mention that. I'm glad you referenced it. Mr. Khalilzad actually said after he left Pakistan, we're heading in the right direction with more steps by Pakistan coming that will lead to concrete results. So if you can just kind of pick up on that point, and I'm going to bring you in on this as well, Imtiaz, in a moment. But David, how key is Pakistan to this?
I think Pakistan is vital. Prime Minister Imran Khan has made discussions and peace through negotiations an important part of his platform from well before he was elected. He is committed to this. There has been a lot of resistance to negotiations in the past from Pakistani security forces. Whether Prime Minister Khan can rein those security forces in and get the Taliban to the table is a challenge for him. And I think we'll be seeing today, in the next week or so, whether he is able to successfully work with his security forces and get the Taliban to the table and start real talks.
Imtiaz, I'd like your insight on that as well. How important, how key is Pakistan to this?
Well, I think the very fact that Zalmay Khalilzad began his shuttle diplomacy from Pakistan, has been here several times, and now the Prime Minister has also flown to Doha, is very much indicates the importance of Pakistan for the entire process. And this is what Pakistan has been saying all along, that beside Pakistan, even Iran is the second biggest strategic stakeholder in the entire process, and that Pakistan, whatever leverage Pakistan has, it has used. And now I think the ultimate objective is to convince the Taliban to give up violence and also go on to talk to the Kabul government, because everybody recognizes the National Unity Government as the legitimate representative of Afghanistan. And I think this is desirable by everybody, that the entire talks basically culminate in direct or indirect negotiations between the Taliban and the National Unity Government. However, I should also clarify what David said earlier. Most of the violence in the last 2 years has been largely carried out by Daesh or ISIS. Yes, Taliban have targeted the security establishment of Afghanistan, and with this I think they had just wanted to underscore that they do not want to inflict any pain on the common people. However, the casualties, yes, happen to be the Afghans, which is condemnable, which is very sad, and I think everybody is extremely keen, including the Pakistani leadership, for violence reduction as a result of the talks, which should be approached, it seems, with more greater degree of trust between Pakistan and the United States, as well as Pakistan and the National Unity Government. I think the mistrust right now remains basically the biggest enemy of any potential success in this round of talks.
I think that's a great point. Omar, your thoughts on that there has to be trust between these parties involved to even move an inch?
Well, the lack of trust is probably the biggest obstacle in moving forward. No doubt, again, I agree with both David and to a certain extent with Zakhilwal, that Pakistan is extremely important, that the recent steps are encouraging. But at the same time, because of the lack of trust, there are enormous doubts whether these efforts are sincere. Will have to be seen as to how things unfold. But at the same time, I think we need to realize that to what extent Pakistan can push things forward. It can certainly prevent Taliban from making peace. But whether it can deliver Taliban or deliver peace, that is debatable. Again, the recent reluctance, even the supposed pressure that the Taliban came under from Pakistan to produce, to bring them to talks in Islamabad, and they refused, or encouraging them to meet in Saudi, in Taliban refused, certainly questions the extent of Pakistan's full ability, as we thought it was, but it's no doubt it has significant influence and has no doubt is the most important country, perhaps regionally, for peace and stability in Afghanistan.
David, has the Afghan government been marginalized at all in this process?
There is certainly the risk of that. The Afghan government, I think, has made clear that peace is not possible without participation by the Afghan government. That's really been the case. I think Ambassador Khalilzad has also been clear that real talks, real peace has to be between Afghans, and that is the goal of his talks with the Taliban, to get the Taliban to sit down with the Afghan government. Right now, the Taliban are talking to all kinds of people in Afghanistan. Various so-called warlords, various political leaders in Afghanistan have had direct or indirect talks with the Taliban. The only people that really remain to be brought into this overall process are the Afghan government. But at the same time, Afghanistan is going through a very vigorous political process. This past week, over 10 candidates and their slates were registered for presidential elections later this year. None of those slates actually supports the Taliban. So I think it's possible the Taliban may be feeling a little bit worried about being left out in the cold as this electoral process moves forward.
Imtiaz, you wrote an open letter to Donald Trump about all of this. And one of the things that you wrote is, if the Taliban, well, Khalilzad said this, let me rephrase. He said, if the Taliban choose to fight over peace talks, the United States would support the Afghan government. That's from Khalilzad. What does that say to you?
Well, I think that was not a smart move on the part of Zalmay Khalilzad, particularly when he made that statement shortly before leaving Kabul after having talks with the National Unity Government leaders, just because he had been presenting himself as the peace broker. But the last thing a peace broker could do is to deploy intimidation on one of the interlocutors. And this is, I think it went down very badly with the Taliban, also with the Pakistani facilitators, just because Pakistan had put in a lot of effort in convincing the Taliban to give up the path of violence and continue talking to the United States. But then this intimidation, this was seen as an intimidation by Zalmay Khalilzad, and it evoked also a very harsh response from the Taliban spokesperson, who said that, well, if they choose to fight us, then we are here to fight. And I think this basically was a very unsmart move, just because time is not on the side of Zalmay Khalilzad or President Trump, whereas Taliban would say that, well, we have been fighting for 17 years, we could go on fighting for another 5 years. So I think this is what I was talking about, that mistrust possibly is the biggest enemy right now, the big elephant in the room, and this is what all sides need to avoid injecting into the talks by trying to stay transparent in their talks with one another.
Omar, somebody has to give something for this to move even a little bit. Who is more likely to give something? What are they willing to give for this not to just be another waste of time?
Well, of course, peace has a cost. It will have a cost to the Afghan government, to the Afghan people who are not Taliban, who do not wish to live under a Taliban rule. But it will also, there has to be a cost for Taliban as well. They have to give up and fighting to reach their end goal, if that is power. They have to give up on complete control of power. They have to give up on overthrowing the government.
Well, what about what about this demand?
Yeah.
What about the sticking point? This demand of theirs that their prisoners be released. Is that something even realistic that would be considered in these talks?
Those are absolutely legitimate talking items, and there is no opposition either, again, from the U.S. envoy for peace or from the Afghan government to be willing to discuss that. In fact, there are items that are way more important that now the U.S. is open to discuss, such as the status of its forces in Afghanistan. And gladly, the recent talks in Doha indicate that discussion on such important items has begun, and I would call it a breakthrough. And in that respect, I do not agree that Khalilzad's recent statements was that big a deal. I mean, he is not a mediator. He is a U.S. government envoy, and therefore he will be stating the position of the U.S. government, which is, okay, preference is peace, but if Taliban continue to fight, then the U.S. will continue to support the Afghan government. That's not a new statement, and you will hear it from any other U.S. envoy as well. And at the end, it did not affect Taliban's willingness to engage and interact with Khalilzad, as today's and yesterday's and possibly tomorrow's discussion of him with Taliban will indicate.
David, if U.S. troops draw down there, will that have any effect on all of this?
Well, the U.S. At one point had well over 100,000 troops in Afghanistan and drew down to 5,000. That did not mean that the Taliban did not come to peace talks then. So U.S. withdrawal of troops has been proven not to be the real object of the Taliban. What the Taliban want is to have the Islamic Emirate back and to rule Afghanistan the way they did before. That is really the crux of the matter. However, 80% of the Afghan people don't want the Taliban. So at this point, what has to give is the Taliban's insistence that they need to bring the Islamic Emirate back into power. Once they pull back from that and sit down and have negotiations, peace can probably be pretty rapidly achieved. In June of this year, there was a 3-day ceasefire. It was amazing that on both sides, Taliban and government, the soldiers sat down with each other and had tea. Families who hadn't seen each other for years visited with each other. There was rejoicing on both sides, on the Taliban side and the government side, about peace. That is what should be the goal for everybody, is that peace. Let me just say one thing about Ambassador Khalilzad. I've worked closely with him over the past 15 years. I would be very careful about underestimating him. And if you think you are going to outmaneuver him, you should be very careful before you criticize him. Thank you.
All right. That will be the last word. Gentlemen, I appreciate this conversation very much. I'm sure we will call on you to continue it at some point. Thank you. Omar Zakhilwal, Imtiaz Gul, and David Sedney. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime. Go to our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.